Hello, today we're going to look at the AQA GCSE, the Natural Hazards Unit, and we're going to look at part 4, which is the management can reduce the effects of tectonic hazards. So if we click on that, we've got all the page references at the top. So this first little bit, why do people continue to live in areas at risk from tectonic hazards? So this is likely to be an explain question, where you'll have to explain the reasons people live in areas where you've got volcanoes, earthquakes, possibly weather hazards as well, such as hurricanes and so on. So what we need is 2 or 3 really good ideas which we can explain. So just underneath all this, there's the type of question you will face. So for example, explain why people choose to live in areas affected by volcanic eruptions. Clearly, this could be changed to tectonic hazards in the sense it could be earthquakes or it could be atmospheric hazards like hurricanes and so on. But the idea being you're going to have to clearly explain why people choose to live in these areas. Now, a good place to start on this would be your Oxford textbook. Just go back to this. So this one here, so you click on this. On page 18 of it, there's a lovely little diagram which goes through loads of different reasons. So the key here is not to try and do too many reasons, but the reasons you give, you have to clearly explain. So you could take any of these to do that. Just to make this really clear in terms of the exam, if we go down to the bottom of the sheet, most 4-mark questions are marked like this. So if it asks you to explain something, you've got to be really clear. So you need some accurate knowledge, which doesn't have to be too much, but you've got to have some knowledge of what you're talking about. But it's this bit here, you've got to develop your answer. You've got to clearly explain it, not just say it is because it is, which is what a lot of people tend to do. If you want more details on the mark scheme, if you click that link there, it'll take you to a sheet with lots of information on the mark scheme. So going back to what we're doing, it's always good to look at the exam, what it would expect of us before we start making any notes. We could take any of these. So earthquake and volcanic eruptions don't happen very often. People living in poverty have other things to think about. So going around all of these, volcanoes bring benefits such as fertile soils. We could use tourism for an example of that. If I switch textbooks to the Hodder textbook, there's a little bit here about tourists visiting volcanoes for spectacular and unique views. So we could combine that work to come up with a really clear point. So our point, always good for any of these, is to make a clear point. Could be that volcanoes bring benefits, but then we need to explain that. So we could mention fertile soils, rocks and so on, but we've got to clearly link that to how it benefits people. So if we're going to use the tourism one, what you might do is first of all, with any of this, I think try and think of an area we're going to look at. It's always good to have a real place. So let's say Mount Vesuvius sat here. So just to give you an idea of where we are, so Mount Vesuvius is here near Naples. You'll have heard of Vesuvius because of the Pompeii disaster, which happened to the Romans. But this volcano could well erupt again. It's not erupted for a long time, not a major eruption. It has done smaller eruptions recently, but it has potentially, it could do another huge pyroclastic flow, and all these densely populated areas around here could well be severely damaged, but people are still choosing to live there. So what we could do is to explain one of the benefits of living here, use tourism to exemplify it. A quick Google search, tourism income Vesuvius. Well, we've got 2.5 million visitors in the area, bringing in millions, like it says there, of dollars. So if we go back to our original notes we're making, if I was making notes on this, I would have, okay, point I'm going to make. So always start with a point. Areas where you've got natural hazards can bring benefits, such as volcanoes bring things like fertile soils, rocks for building, rich deposits, and then tourism. And then I might develop that idea by saying, so The spectacular volcanic landscape attracts tourists, such as Vesuvius, attracting millions of tourists every year. They spend money in the area, create an economy, therefore attracting people to live in this area, meaning people choose to live in this hazardous area. What you've got to do is be really clear. That is clear, really showing that the volcanoes bring benefits. There are many benefits, such as tourism, for instance. If it's attracting millions of people to an area, they're going to spend money in the area. That's going to be good for people who live there because they can sell things to the tourists. They can make money from the tourists, meaning, that's the reason why they've chosen to live in this hazardous area. Really clear. That's a very different answer to someone saying, well, volcanoes have rich soils, building materials, and attract tourists. That's not clearly saying why people are choosing to live there. It's just saying the volcanoes bring benefits. You have to directly link it to why people are living there. And that's the trick with all GCSE questions when you're answering something like this, is being really clear. And the difference between somebody who gets a really high grades, 7s and above, and those who don't, is the ones that get a higher grade are far clearer. So make a point. Some areas with natural hazards, the natural hazard itself creates benefits. There's lots of these, for example, volcanic eruptions. Talk about the richer soils, so you could talk about farming and tourism, but then directly tie it to why people choose to live there. For the tourism one, you don't even need to use Vesuvius, but it might make it easier. So volcanoes can attract millions of people like Mount Vesuvius. And we could jump to this, 2.5 million visitors each year, which means they all spend money in the area. It means people make an income in the area. So therefore, people choose to live in this area even though it's hazardous. That's point one. With a 4-mark question, I would give at least 2 points. The second point might be a different one. Now you can choose any of them. So for example, you might choose the one where the volcanoes don't erupt very often. Well, we've just said in Vesuvius, there's not been a major eruption since the one that hit Pompeii. So you can then, but you've got to clearly talk about why that means people choose to live there, not just say it does. And what I would think about this is if you did 2 paragraphs here of about 3 or 4 lines each, which clearly tie the clearly explain why people live here, you'll get the marks. And as I say, the people who don't do as well are the ones which don't quite explain it. They just say there's lots of benefits in the area, but don't really explain how those benefits cause people to choose to live there. And that's the difference. The second part of this is how monitoring, prediction, protection can reduce risk from tectonic hazards. So for this one, I would be thinking about, first of all, being clear on what each one of these things actually means. So what is monitoring? What is prediction? And so on. You could be asked a definition of any of them for 1 mark. So the definitions are given there. But the other question you might get is thinking about one of them, could be any one of them, and explain how it reduces risk. So risk, really, it's talking about the risk of harm. So disaster risk will be a risk of major harm, because a disaster is causes major harm. So to reduce the risk of that happening, how does each one do it? So the type of question you will get here, it might be, suggest how, in this case, monitoring earthquakes can reduce the risk they pose to people. So again, with this one, you've got to say really clearly how the monitoring of an earthquake can reduce risk, not just what monitoring is. So for example, if we look in the Hodder textbook, it tells you what they are. So the key with monitoring, if you're going to make this point, is if you monitor something, you can start to make predictions of what it's going to do and when it's going to do it and where. Now it depends which natural hazard you're looking at. You might want to use your case studies from earlier, because if you've already done these named examples for part 3, and how the response is varied, some of this will become useful here. So if we're trying to monitor an earthquake or a volcano, what you might do is monitor the past patterns. Or for a volcano, if it starts changing shape, you might be able to predict what's going to happen next. But then you've got to then take that to the point where you can actually say, okay, so then we can actually reduce the risk. So for example, if you're monitoring a volcano and it starts to emit gases which weren't there before, or as a change, it might mean something's changing within the volcano. So that means that people can then be given a warning that actually the volcano is changing. If you live in this area, it might be worth leaving the area, excluding people from the area, even forcing an evacuation. So if that volcano explodes, the risk to people is reduced because they've been moved out. The same could be true of tracking a hurricane. If you monitor a hurricane in the ocean, you can start to work out which area of coast it's likely to hit, meaning you can move people out of the way. So what you've got to do with each of these words is be able to clearly show how it reduces risk. So protection, for instance, might mean improving building design. So if you're in an earthquake zone, if you build every building to withstand an earthquake level on the moment magnitude scale of a 7, it means if you get any earthquake up to a 7, the people living in those buildings are less likely to be harmed. You've reduced the risk of harm, the chance of harm. You could tie that into monitoring and prediction. If you monitor and predict well, you can work out the likely size of earthquake in an area. So that helps you protect people. Because if you know in an area which is on, say, a conservative margin, the biggest earthquakes you get tend to be, say, a 7, it means you can design your buildings accordingly. So the protection bit is actually taking action with the buildings or educating people. So when it does happen, whatever it is, say it's an earthquake, people can start to take appropriate action. That might be long term, like planning buildings, or it might be sorting out what's likely to be damaged in the event and planning evacuations and so on, which is on the next one. So for each one, you've got to be clear how it actually reduces the risk, but also be aware that they're all linked. You can't really get protection right if you don't predict what you're actually facing. So if you've got a prediction that this area every year has got a 1 in 50 chance of a magnitude 7 earthquake, you then can build your protection accordingly. But if you don't have that prediction and you build all your buildings to withstand a magnitude 5 and a 7 happens, your risk is going to go up, so the protection won't be as effective. So if you get a question like this one at the bottom, suggest how one of them can reduce the risk, it's suggesting how it might work. So a really simple idea would be if you predict a volcanic eruption, it means you can evacuate people, therefore reducing the chance of harm. And that's what we mean by being clear, not just saying, well, if we monitor a volcano, it means you put tilt meters in, you measure gases and so on. If you don't directly link that to how it reduces risk, you get 2 out of 4. But if you just make that link, that if the gas levels change because you've noticed that through monitoring, which means you might be able to predict there's an eruption, therefore move people out of the way, and the crucial bit at the end means that they're not there when the volcanic eruption happens, meaning the risk to people is now much, much less, that part answers the question. The risk to people is less. And if you can give 2 ideas about that, then you're going to get all 4 marks. And if you go back down to this generic mark scheme, that's what we mean by developing it. Not just sort of saying what monitoring is, but developing an actual explanation. Okay, we'll leave it there.